Hello. Yeah. Thanks, Willie, for that birthday song. And thank you all for being, again, part of this conversation, for being part of these birthday celebrations, and for staying for this second panel, which I think it's going to be really, really interesting. This panel is presented by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas. We underwrite this event through corporate sponsors and donors, but they play no role in determining the panel's content or the guests or any kind of questions. Again, we're going to have 60 minutes to talk about this issue of the challenge of affordability in our cities. This will be, we're going to have 45 minutes of conversation here, and then we'll have 15 minutes to ask questions. Again, if you can, we encourage you to ask as many questions as you can, but please go directly to the point so that we can get as many people next to the microphones as possible. And I want you all to welcome the panelists here. We have with us Drennon. She's the Director of Urban Studies at the Trinity University in San Antonio. We have Commissioner Adrian Garcia representing the Precinct 2 in Harris County. And we also have Miriam Igufi, Vice President of Policy Development and Research at the DHA, also known as the Dallas Housing Authority. So let's give them all a nice round of applause. And we were going to have State Representative Garnet Coleman from Houston. Sadly, he couldn't make it. I'm very sorry about that. But we're going to try to make it up with really good questions and answers, right? And this is an issue that we see every day in our cities, cities becoming more affordable. We speak about this American crisis of affordability. But let's start with something very, very simple. Dr. Igufi, you, before this, you were in the research world, before the position that you have now. So you know this issue very well. What is affordability, and what do we mean by that? We keep talking about this 30%, but what does that mean to you?
Right, so thank you for having me. I think it's a loaded question, but it's a very important one. We do take for granted this rule of thumb of 30%, such as if you pay more than 30% of your income towards housing and utilities, you will be considered as cost burden and facing affordability issues. And it's something that transpires in about every housing policy or housing program in this country and in other countries. So it's a very pervasive rule, very at the heart of everything. So I think it's very important for us to really investigate what are the justification and the foundation of the income ratio metric. And let's get like housing geeky a little bit, because that's what I like to do. So the rule of thumb really came from the 19th century. So like 1800, where early German statistician looked at, how families were consuming housing and really food at the time and say, you know what, if they're spending money this way, then that's what's affordable, all right? So they really made the assumption, really massaging the data on, descriptive statistics that were really early statistics into what a household should be spending. And that rule, because of its simplicity, has persisted through the years and the century, and here we are today, really gauging whether or not folks are able to meet their housing need based on that rule. And if I may continue, I think one of the big issues is that this income ratio metric does not take into consideration non-housing goods. And so one of the approach that I tend to favor is more of what's left after you actually consume housing, so what's left after you pay for housing, and that's what it's usually referred as a residual income approach, right? And really taking into account your ability to afford transportation and to afford food and childcare, all those basic necessities that really make housing more transformative for your life. So being in a world of affordable housing myself, the way it affects my practice is more that, the underlying question is, are families that are receiving housing assistance exempt from affordability pressure by the mere reception of that housing subsidy? And I can tell you now that this is not the approach that we're taking. So a lot of the work, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, actually revolves outside the realm of housing. in an attempt to really combine housing subsidy and more assistance.
So housing authorities, housing departments, institutions related to housing should start looking at other indicators like the capacity to save, for example, or leisure time. How much leisure time do you have?
It's so complex because, I mean, housing authorities, we're bounded by a very tight regulatory and statutory context, and we have to navigate as creatively as possible to really look at affordability differently, but we still, when it comes to eligibility and what portion of the rent a household should bear, we have to refer to the statute, which is it's 30% of your income, right? And this is how you're going to pay rent. So it's very difficult to step aside that very tight regulatory and statutory context.
Christine, from your experience in research and working with San Antonian communities, do you see that this kind of like narrow definition and maybe a little bit antiquated definition of affordability affects what you do?
Completely. But I'm going to even build on this because we can talk about affordability and everybody has their own personal affordability level, even if like with the 30%, right? And so there's a misunderstanding when we use the term affordability often because I have an affordability level. But someone and I'm middle class, right? I'm a teacher, but someone who is very low income also has an affordability level. On top of that, then we get into these percentages of AMI, area median income, and we often, I think, and it's because of a HUD definition also, we use an MSA or Metropolitan Statistical Area to judge 80% of AMI, for example. Well, San Antonio and most cities, other than places like New York City and San Francisco, the suburbs have a much higher income level than the inner cities. Right, so when we take an MSA and we say, well, like this is what we're going to consider affordable and this is what we'll incentivize, for example, and which is a big thing in San Antonio right now, 80% of our AMI is actually a higher income level than the San Antonio income average. So we are using public dollars to incentivize housing that we can't afford in our city. So it's partly the 30%, but then we even add on these other layers. Again, they're coming from a national level that aren't working anymore.
Commissioner, does these definitions impact the way that you work and the policies that you try to put together?
Yes, and first of all, thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be with this distinguished panel. And I'll just say that, we're struggling with what is the policy because it's a moving target. In Precinct 2, for example, I have amongst the lowest median income of all of Harris County. And as a result, I believe we have amongst the lowest home ownership rate. So more people are renting than owning. And then you add on top of that I have amongst the highest number of children and families without health insurance. So when you calculate all of that, is 30% the right target to be working towards? And the answer is probably not. And then with the fact that East Harris County is almost entirely outside of our metro transit system service area, then you get into this conversation of what does it mean for the quality of life and accessibility to good paying jobs. And then you layer on other things like food deserts and things of that nature that are also to be considered. So yes, this is a very difficult policy issue. And then not to forget, and I know we'll talk about it, but the fact that our area, for better or for worse, is in the midst of, or has been in the midst of gentrification. And so property values are growing extraordinarily fast and high, which is challenging local government on being able to provide adequate and real affordable housing. And then you layer on the last element, the NIMBYs. When you get to talking about what is affordable housing, what that really means, and what it registers in the brains of neighbors, you get into a much more complex situation.
Yes, sorry, Mary.
And I really think it might be worth highlighting that some of the inadequacy behind the rule are not affecting everybody the same way. And I would posit that maybe some of those issues affect folks at the lower tail of the income spectrum, as opposed to Bob making $1 million a month, spending 31% of his income towards housing. I'm sure he's living the big life, right? But someone on fixed income who's making maybe like $600 a month, spending 29%, so technically not facing affordability issues, are facing affordability issues. Mm-hmm. And so I think we really have to take a very deep look at what the data says and what it misses as well, so what it just doesn't say to us, and really be critical of what it means for folks that are more vulnerable economically.
Commissioner, I wanted to go back to something that you just mentioned. You spoke about NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and I'm curious about how you see it affecting your work. In other states, we're seeing strong movements towards YIMBY legislation, so yes in my backyard, and then we could dig deeper, and there's a conversation that it shouldn't be just YIMBY, it should be yes to affordable housing in my backyard. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit of where we are there? How far are we from YIMBY legislation, and how it affects your work?
It's a real issue, especially when you have elected officials having to be part of the driving force of the policy, because the NIMBYs tend to threaten you with your re-elections. Right. And so it creates real problems. And so there has to be political courage to move these policies forward. I remember when I served on Houston City Council and began to understand the homeless issue, and recognizing that single residency occupancy product had to be a part of the equation. But boy, talk about developing and supporting SROs in a particular neighborhood. I still have a lot of scar tissue and cartilage and shrapnel in my body. I don't go through TSA without being screened again. But I supported it. Even at the threat of being unelected, I supported it because it is a part of the equation. We have to come to grips with the fact that if we do not want homelessness in our community, we do not want people sleeping in our parks, under our bridges, on the sides of our roadways, then we have to be much more broader in our thinking. And so the NIMBYism is a huge challenge, but I think part of the way we move away from that is to make sure that we're educating our public, our community well, to understand that affordable housing doesn't mean Section 8 housing by itself, and that we have to also think about that police officers and firefighters and teachers and other members of the respected workforce are also part of the constituency of affordable housing.
I want to hear from what's going on in that sense in San Antonio. San Antonio is such an interesting city. It's maybe we could say a little bit behind in terms of the displacement and gentrification that we've seen in places like Austin to a certain degree. But you have these beautiful neighborhoods, and I assume that you have a lot of NIMBYism in the city. How do you experience that tension in San Antonio between the NIMBYism protection of those neighborhoods and the issue of affordability?
San Antonio is the most fantastic city in the country. It's just, it is so unique, and it's so beautiful, and please come and visit and see the neighborhoods. But actually, just coincidentally, I do have. There's a movement, right? Mi barrio no se vende. My neighborhood is not for sale. And we are aware of what's happened in Austin and in other places. San Antonio is always, don't let anybody tell you differently, there's always been a Mexican-American city. And that's deeply, deeply in our neighborhoods and in the entire culture of the city. And right now, people are extremely fearful, right? The statistics came out about a month ago that we are the poorest, the highest poverty level city of all of the big cities, of all like the Big 10, Big 15. We have the highest level of people in poverty. But we also have a lot of home ownership. And our home ownership has been going down also. But what we've got, and it's almost like, it's like capital is circling, right? There's this helicopter out there that's just circling and trying to find a place to land. And that's terrifying people, because our inner city neighborhoods have been very disinvested. So this is where capitalists really wants to land, and is making, really we're creating kind of a conversation about, well, how can capital get in there and start building? So we talk about segregation, and we have to get rid of segregation, and how we're going to do it with building. Well, is that the best way? And so what we're doing in San Antonio is mi barrio no se vende, is my neighborhood is not for sale, and some serious grassroots organizing on getting people involved, and really watching and educated in things like zoning, because it's in these little tiny things where the action takes place. Right? These little changes in codes, right, that are behind a lot of our backs. And that's how some of this is taking place. We've got tax credit properties going in now in really vulnerable neighborhoods. So they've got a 15, 20-year, promise to remain affordable, and then what? The research from around the country is showing that with a lot of those tax credit mixed income properties that go in, they ultimately do lead to displacement. So these are conversations that we're trying to have all over in San Antonio, especially on our west side.
Commissioner?
Yes, I want to add to the conversation that, and you're absolutely correct, that also here in Houston, Harris County, that there is this challenge of neighborhoods not wanting to sell. The challenge, though, is, and I'm not sure what it is in Dallas or in San Antonio, but in Houston, or Harris County better yet, the appraisal district and property appraisals is really what is creating the challenge to affordability.
Which way?
And we have yet to really reform that aspect of our system. And I think once we can ever get there, that will be a major transformation. Coupled with the fact that on the point of segregation, I was a participant of the racial integration of HISD schools. And when you look at the effort of segregating and trying to eliminate that, and you look at schools today, while we have no more active desegregation policies or efforts, we're still a segregated community. So I think at the end of the day, we must work with the community to help us decide what those policies ought to be, because I think at the end of the day, communities will find areas and want to be in areas that they are most comfortable in, whatever that looks like.
I also wanted to ask you about this factor of preserving housing affordability. One thing is to build, right? Another way of looking at this is to actually keep things affordable, keep the stock that we already have affordable. And I guess that with the pressures from the market, and we also see this craziness about everybody wanting to flip houses, it becomes very difficult. I was like a month ago reporting here about the expansion of the I-45 highway and talking to people in Independence Heights, and they would tell me, there was a lady, a 90-year-old lady, I was asking her about the pressures in her home, and she would tell me that she constantly would have calls from people trying to buy it. Of course, she's 90-something, she doesn't have any interest, and I would go like, so how common were these calls? And she would say, every day actually. And then I started asking in the neighborhood, and it was the same everywhere. So is it difficult? First, is it worth it to fight this fight in terms of trying to preserve what we already have, and how much of a dent can do in terms of the huge challenge of affordability that we have in Texas, for example, in the case of Dallas?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that anybody would disagree with that. I think one of the big reasons why we're seeing this affordability problem is that we are unable to preserve and to build affordable housing. So as a point of reference, often I wouldn't say opponents of publicly supported housing, but folks that are not so much aligned with housing subsidy tend to tell us that, well, there is no housing supply for your vouchers to go anywhere, so what are we fighting? And actually there is, right? But they are in non-segregated areas in other jurisdictions, and so really the fight that we're having is to locate affordable housing and to preserve it. So on our end, the Dallas Housing Authority, we don't have the prerogatives to really preserve affordable housing, maybe for public housing stock, but it's still going to be very limited and a drop in the ocean. So really our eyes are turned to municipalities and some of the policy tools that they may enact to prevent the conversion of apartments into condos, or to protect tenants for them to be able to have the first right of refusal on their unit, or to be able to be given proper notice and proper education about certain neighborhoods where they could afford and still preserve the same quality of life. So I think there is a really big policy of toolbox that a lot of us practitioners and policymakers are aware of. I think the real problem is that you have competing interests at stake. So you have like the real estate big muscles on one end, and then you have the community that tends to have very dispersed energy, which makes it difficult to be at the table, like unified. And then you have the city trying to really combine community development with return on investment. And those really competing interests are, I think, one of the biggest impediments to preserving housing. Because again, I don't think that any of us today is going to get like a new housing policy out of our head that nobody has heard of before. There is like plenty of resources out there. We know what could be done. But the issue is we have very varying market conditions, and the political will may also vary across our jurisdictions. And so it's a matter of really aligning all of those policy agents and the economic and real estate sector to support the preservation of affordable housing and the building of affordable housing.
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
We have traditionally housed lower income households and families in housing that is what we call filtered down. Right? And a small smattering, right? A small percentage has been in publicly provided housing. Thank goodness. And we've relied on that system of older housing filtering down through income levels to house the lower income. We've done that forever. With the latest recession and a lot of changes since the 1980s in the United States economy, what we call the financialization of the economy, money now is in real estate and investment. Mm-hmm. And so these neighborhoods that is where we've housed lower income families, now are investment tools. These are where people are making a lot of money. And actually, the most profitable neighborhoods to have rental properties in are low income. Because low-income houses, investors usually own that house outright. So they're not paying a mortgage, yet they're charging a rent that's comparable to anywhere else. Versus in a higher income neighborhood, they're still paying mortgage, which is probably taking up 2/3, 3/4 of that rental income. Right? So this has become an incredible, there's like movement of buying up properties in low-income neighborhoods, allowing them to continue to decay, without deferring maintenance, any kind of maintenance, because then the profit margin becomes greater, and we're not staying on top of that whole movement. And then we've got the flipping and the speculation on top of that.
Yeah, and I just want to add that one of the other challenges is that the simplest affordable housing product that can be provided is multifamily housing. But that's not really at the end of the day, what you're trying to achieve in the community to create legacy wealth. That's not the product to do. In the hardest or the most costly product to provide the community that should equate to respectful and respectable affordable housing that leads the family into a better direction is single-family product, but it's the most costly.
I would also posit maybe one of the facets that we have yet maybe talked about is the location of affordable housing, so the current housing stock and the projected or sought-after stock that we want to build in higher opportunity areas, and that really is a point of contention, I think, for researchers, practitioners, and policymakers alike. And I'm just thinking about the LIHTC, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. I think it's probably one of the most controversial one. It's the largest project-based housing programs on the tax credit side. But I know that in Dallas we have a very energized fight around should we be able to build low-income housing tax credits in a higher poverty area, knowing that some research has shown that this can be an engine for neighborhood revitalization, or should we put it in higher opportunity areas, which is not going to cut it for the developers, right? And so there is a geography to what's feasible, what's economically profitable, and what it's profitable for the developers and for the families, and often those misaligned. And I think we have yet found a way to a point of convergence between economic feasibility. I don't want to vilify developers. I don't want to vilify landlords because, I think they are really business arguments to be fully taken into consideration. But at the same time, we think about housing in terms of structure, but my primary eyes is really on families and children, right? Like housing in and of itself as a building is meaningless. It's really the impact on the community and the family. And so far, I think we're falling short of our promises in the housing industry.
And coupled with the fact that, where you want to and need affordable housing is where the work centers are. But you can't afford it.
Or when we can afford it, you have structural impediments that really just prevent you from accessing housing. I'm just, again, referring to the federal housing assistance side of the housing discussion. So for the voucher program, source of income discrimination is a huge problem. So actually yesterday we've done like a quick analysis so I can get my numbers right, but just as a quick synopsis, the way the voucher program works, it's really giving a license to hunt to a family, and as long as the unit passes inspection and is not higher than the fair market rent that HUD establishes, then you're ready to go. The issue that we have is that in Texas, landlords are enabled to say no to someone who actually has the financial means through the voucher to access it. And so I'm pretty baffled in terms of what can we do. The stock that we have in Dallas, I think that a little bit more than half of it, looking at multifamily, is actually affordable from a payment standard perspective. But again, we have that de jure segregation or problem that is really impeding that federal programs to really reach its full potential and be true to its initial intent.
And in the Housing Authority, you have worked into like finding really interesting ways of how to convince those landlords, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
How interesting it is.
Yeah. You've made also you're working in a system that will make all the process faster so that they have less excuses to say no, right? Can you tell us about that?
You're so cool. I get to brag right now. I appreciate you. So, again, I don't want to vilify landlords, but source of income discrimination business with housing authorities, but it's a process, all right? So, like in a tight market, like in Dallas, and I'm sure in other big cities, you don't get to get your unit vacant for more than like a couple days or weeks, right? Time is money. And so one thing that we are trying to do on the housing authority side is to really meet the business standards, right? What are the expectations of the private market that we have to match? And so we know that we have to move faster with our paperwork. We know that sometimes we have to use financial incentive to really help debunk the myth around what Section 8 folks are. By the way, this is no longer called Section 8, right? So some of the tools that we're using are financial in nature. So it's looking at, utility deposit. I think we're looking at mitigation funds as well. We also offer more than the fair market rent. So let's say HUD says this unit is worth $1,000. We can go up to 125% of that value, right? Which can be problematic because then landlords can inflate their prices because they know we're going to pay for it anyway, but we haven't observed that behavior just yet. So we're doing that. So we're also going through, believe it or not, 2019 digital transformation. We're trying to move away from paper-based processing. And so we are building an online process with something similar to smart contracts. So instead of like the voucher holder, which is a family, going to the landlord, getting the signature, doing the visit, they can do all of this online. So it's not live yet, but something super cool that is live that we're doing, and we hope that other housing authorities and municipalities will jump on board to adopt this AI that we have developed. is usually if you want to get a unit on the market, so if you want the unit to be leased under the voucher program, it has to pass inspection. So when you think about the size of our housing authority, we are one of the largest in the country. It's going to take a little while for us to go, find an inspector, to go in that whatever county, because we cover 7. So what we're doing is a Uber-like experience, right? So it's live. You would see the car coming to your house, and if you want to reschedule, you can tell Bob the AI that, hey, I'm not in my house, and directly the inspector receives an alert on his phone and is rerouted elsewhere. And with that, you would achieve great economies of scale, and you would be a better business partner by following up live with your landlord. And so far, we have seen great return on that AI technology, and that's something that we briefed the federal government about, and they are pretty thrilled about the potential impact industry-wise. So that's one of the couple facets of our work. So really using tech and policy to be better business partners, and also appealing financially to what the private market would like to receive to enter the Section 8 program.
So it's basically giving no excuse to the landlord to say no.
We're getting there. I mean, to be honest, I think there are many issues as of why voucher holders tend to reside in the most impoverished neighborhoods, right? So some are structural, the one that I have described. Other are informational gaps. Like our families are unaware of the possibilities of housing and maybe don't fully understand or in depth some of the impacts of raising your kids in this neighborhood as opposed to this one. So we have another initiative that is geared toward children, where we're targeting the most impoverished neighborhoods where voucher holders are residing, and doing a pretty aggressive mobility counseling campaign to give them not only the financial tool with moving expenses and all this negotiation with the landlord, but also better understand their ability to relocate to a higher opportunity area, and also see whether or not that's something they would like to consider, and educate them about your child having access to a higher performing school would most likely, result in higher income earnings during his lifetime, right? So really coupling the programmatic aspect of, educational mobility counseling, but also how do we administer our program as better business partners? So that's what the THA is doing right now.
Another way of approaching the issue is keeping the landlord and creating land trust, right?
That's correct.
Commissioner, I know that you've worked on this issue. I was curious if you can tell us a little bit of the behind the scenes of doing this, and what kind of challenges did you have, and how far are you right now?
I tell you, it's very exciting when you can step into an environment where you are really at ground zero. And Harris County did not have a mechanism. And so we created the land trust earlier this year by part of my agenda item. And so the land trust has been established. We're now working to create another enterprise component to it. So that's being currently established. So, the challenge for us in Harris County has been we had no infrastructure, virtually none. And so we've gotten that. We also work to identify and have adopted the concentrated revitalization areas in the precinct. And then most recently, a little bit to what the doctor was mentioning, is that on the down payment assistance, Harris County still had a very, very archaic way of doing business. It was a onesie, twosie process. If someone gets their application done, then they work to get it on the agenda, and then assuming they meet the agenda deadline, it gets put on a particular schedule, and then we approve it, and then a paper check is cut, and then it has to be physically delivered. And so we have now, I'm careful to say reformed it, because it's still not where we want it to be, but we believe that we will be saving somewhere between 30 to 60 days off the process. And even though that doesn't sound like a great deal, sellers, as it was mentioned, they want to get their check as quickly as possible, and they're going to sell to whoever can give them the check the fastest. Mm-hmm. And so this little reform that we've done, I think is it's cutting edge for a 18th century environment, and but we're pushing forward. And I did want to go back to something else that's a challenge, at least in Harris County, is that, look, if you haven't heard, we tend to flood around here. And so after that, we always go back and look at the flood maps. And when you're working with federal dollars, you can't develop product in flood zone areas. And so pretty soon, I think we're going to have islands where we can develop, but it's going to be problematic.
Yes, Christine, go ahead.
Sorry, areas of opportunity. I want to hop back because everybody's been talking about that, right? And the option, especially with choice vouchers, Section 8, whatever we call them, and where do people go with them? I think there was a big study that just came out recently in some press, I don't remember where, and trying to get information out that some schools are better than others, blah, blah, blah. The thing with that is that lower income families are so much more dependent on their own social networks than higher income families are. And their social income networks, their social networks are more based on propinquity or their spatial and geographic, right? More than mine, and my dad lives in Rochester, New York, right? And we're in touch. It's a different, just because of media and communications and things. So when we think at the level of the individual that this child would be better off in this school over here, that may be true. But we also have to continue to think at the level of the community. And how does that community function? And how does that child fit within that community? And are we preserving some of the social network which holds that family in place, right? That is their protection mechanisms because of the absence of a welfare state. That is so important, especially in a city like San Antonio, and where family is important to everybody. Right? I know that, but in a city like ours, it's so poor, and the family is what's keeping everybody kind of just afloat. That when we start to think in terms of the individual and moving children to these areas, we also have to think about how the family actually fits into a community and what's the value of the community.
And that's hopefully a value that, for example, Latino families won't lose as they grow older and we have newer generations, because it's a great asset that they have. We were talking before about health, and it's an asset that impacts the health. There's that famous study after a drought and a heat wave in Chicago, where we had Latino families having much better ways to deal with it than white families,
yep,
right?
That's and absolutely in San Antonio again. Our poorest zip code is 78207, which is immediately west of downtown. It's one of the poorest urban zip codes in the entire country. People don't want to leave, right? People don't want to leave because it's also a safety net. And so that the other way to think about it is, well, maybe can we elevate people, right? Not just get them out and hope that they'll do better, but can we just pour resources in? Can we think much more deeply about the public education and the resources in some of the neighborhoods and lift them up, rather than kind of taking people out and replacing them now with a whole new batch of people? Because people are moving to San Antonio just like they're moving to Texas. They tend to be a very different demographic. We're all excited about the newcomers, but we're not taking care of the people who really built this city.
So I'd like to maybe offer a parallel perspective. So I would certainly concur that there is no universal design of a program that would, foster upward mobility through relocation for every family. I think, however, we often hypothesize on what people want and are able to do. And I would like to say, from a practical standpoint, one of the things that we're doing is to really go through an in-depth interview to gauge the extent to which a family is willing to relocate. So it's really discussing commuting patterns to, would you reconsider going this far? What is your strong point of attach, like my healthcare provider, my grandma, or so forth? So we do take into consideration the existing social network. But I would like to say that looking at, we technically have a sub-program in our voucher program, which is called a Walker program. It's part of a DSEG lawsuit that we had a little while ago. And what we have found is that families are eager to move, right? And so, of course, it's not going to be true for everybody, but looking at the grand scale of our program, and we're looking at 55,000 individuals, people want to locate to higher areas. It doesn't impact everybody. It doesn't materialize into like income gain right away. But I think if we want to have a success at the household level, then we need to have very individualized conversation. Some folks don't want to move, but a lot of them with children, at least in our program, want the Walker voucher, want to be able to go to Plano or there's like northern suburb to make sure that their children get a chance. And again, it's not true to every family, but it's an overwhelming tendency in our program. And I certainly concur, it's not a one-way street. It's not about relocating everybody because you have like a scalability issue anyway. You can't move everybody because then you have the same problem, right? So it's really also investing in those neighborhoods. But I would like to say that one of the primary approach that we have is really like facilitating immediate relocation for families with children that are living in the most impoverished neighborhood, because that's where the higher gains are realized, is when children, usually under the age of 13, relocate to higher opportunity areas.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So if you have any question that you want to ask, there's 2 microphones here, and please start coming down. But I wanted to ask a last question. We've been doing a very rooted conversation, like at street level, focusing on low-income communities. And I wanted to take you now to the state level. Our state, as we all know, has been going through this huge growth, larger than any other state in the country. And that growth is led by our biggest cities. If we take out Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, we wouldn't be there in the ranking, right? But at the same time, we're seeing that our cities are experiencing this affordability issue. And a lot of people come to Texas because of the affordability. It's one of the issues that it's mentioned when you see the anecdotal reports, the interviews on TV. But the recent data from the census shows that between 2008 and 2018, rents grew in 17.2% in Texas. That's more than they grew in California, New York, Florida, which are like the large states that we compare with, right? So is this sustainable, or do we have a disaster in the making here, or like something that's going to stop our growth, that thing that we keep talking about in Texas?
Juan Pablo, I'll just say, as the politician on the panel, we have to change our way of thinking at the state legislative level. The governor has got to get it and provide leadership that this is an important aspect to the long-term future and economic stability of our state. The GLO has to get it because after natural disasters like Harvey, it is ridiculous to put policies in place that would force people that if they so need the help and decide to get the recovery dollars through the GLO, that they would have to downsize their homes. If you're not aware that if you had children in your home, say 3 kids, and you had bedrooms for each, and they grew up and moved out, and then your home is hit by Hurricane Harvey, and you're applying for that recovery assistance, now you are only eligible for a 2-bedroom assistance. You can't remodel the other bedrooms in your house. That is ridiculous. And so we have to get beyond this way of thinking and recognize that affordable housing and affordable housing closest to the employment sectors is critical to the long-term success. But I will end my comment with where I started earlier, and that is that we must provide legislative reform to the appraisal districts in Texas.
You asked, I wrote it down. Does this threaten, does what's happening in housing threaten the growth of the state? And God, I hope so. I really hope so. Because we are catering this growth, right? And I think you mean there's economic growth, but there's also population growth. And I think those two are very intertwined. But we're talking a lot about population. But it is a particular demographic that's coming in, and we cater to them, and we're not taking care of our own. We're not protecting people, we're not educating them, we're not keeping people healthy. But we're spending a lot of money on bringing people in. So I hope it's not, and I know that there's lots of cameras. But some's got, at some point, we need to look back and say, what is going on in our neighborhoods, and with the people that keep this economy stable and going, not just growing, but sustained.
It's absolutely not sustainable. Yeah. I want one after, okay? It's not sustainable. I think that, so far we've been mainly talking about publicly supported housing and then, building the housing stock, but not so much about what it costs not to do it, right? And we have yet had a study in Texas to really quantify the lost opportunities and the cost in terms of health issues and homelessness, which is also part of housing, which tends to be treated in silo. So I would say it's not sustainable. Just to give you a tangible figure, called my CFO this morning to get a sense of what is the need in Dallas-Fort Worth. And usually our waiting list of our 70,000 people both. Right? And we only have 15,000 vouchers that we can allocate. So that really screams you that there is an incredible need for housing assistance. And I think we are really just building the pipeline to create more housing issues by not catering to people at risk and people that are currently vulnerable and not receiving assistance while they are eligible. So I certainly concur that I think we are confusing housing development with the economic engine of the city, and we're almost losing all pulse as a community. And so we really have to realign, again, economic development, which is a reality. It needs for our city to sustain itself, but at the same time, how can we not sacrifice people along the way? So really making sure that in terms of housing policies and investment, we're not morally bankrupt, and that we are really, equity targeted, and that we're making, I really think that in terms for the city of Dallas and Dallas-Fort Worth area, we have to really push for deep income targeting policies, right? The targeting of people at 30% AMI, 10% AMI, because those are most likely at risk of another economic shock that's going to put them on the street. And I don't think that as a society, this is our normative commitment and moral commitment. So not sustainable.
And Commissioner, just to finish with you, on top of what we've talked, we also have a legislature that has limited the capacity of cities to find revenue and find sources of
The revenue cap
financing.
will be a incredible boondoggle. It will hurt the growth of Texas. It will hurt the economic opportunities of the state. It will hurt it's going to hurt mostly the local communities, cities, and counties to effectively deal with our local issues. We need to have that rescinded.
Okay.
I think he was standing first.
You just did a question, last one, so if you don't mind, we can start with you.
Oh, last one. So I had three. So I guess.
Okay, let's try to keep it direct.
No, they're real short.
Okay.
They're real short. Thank you so much, Commissioner Garcia, for what you're doing, and bravo for the land trust earlier. That's right on. You kind of answered my questions from a GLO standpoint, so I'll go to the next. Is there a white paper in place for the AI solution that you spoke about earlier? And then I have one question for you. Go ahead.
Sure. So there is room for those who actually want to buy the product from us. So housing authorities who don't want to have to invest in the R&D to actually just jump in and start using it. And we can also, I'm sure, facilitate or effectuate the penetration of this new technology inside the staff. But if you look at, I'm sorry, the Texas Tribune, I think Dallas Observer or the Dallas Morning News, you will see the article.
You can leave now.
I am so sorry.
Okay. We love the morning news.
Okay, how could you do that? I'm not even sure which one it is. But you would have a description of what the AI entails and how it's been affecting our business, and I'm more than welcome. I'm willing to give you my business card to further discuss it. And also, I didn't talk about it, but we're looking for cities to also have their housing inspectors looking at compliance to benefit from housing inspectors, so we can find, again, economies of scales across housing authorities and cities.
And one last question for you on the San Antonio. How do you see the trends, and what's the percentage of flippers in some of the low-income areas versus folks who are putting their flags in the ground early before it gentrifies? Because that's what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Depends on the part of town. On what we consider the east side, it's done. It's gentrified, and it's almost impossible to get in there anymore into the Near East Side. On the west side, like San Antonio, we are lucky. You know, people say, well, we're behind. You know, and we don't think we're behind. We think we think we're in a good place. And there's a lot of real, serious, very grassroots level activism to try to get people with those signs. Barrio no se vende, right? And these are signs now that that you see popping up. At the same time, when I do searches on our appraisal data, you see a lot of properties passing into LLCs, right? So people are buying them behind some kind of facade.
And can signs or like community advocacy and actually be effective in a larger way and
hope so.
maybe change policy?
See, we hope so. We hope so. In other cities, they're talking about speculation taxes and flip taxes, that you've got to stay in a house for a couple of years, owner occupied. You have to stay in, and that maybe that's pushing it, but you at least have to own a house for a set many years, 2, 5, before you can flip it, right? Or you're going to pay enormous taxes, and we're going to use that money to put it into housing, right? And I'm hoping that we can get there before we have to. Well, we need to be talking about that, but we just need to encourage people to stay put and not be forced out. If they want to move, more power to you, but don't get forced out, which is what we're seeing with this LLC thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr.
Commissioner Adrian, you have a huge district, plenty of land. What I've heard today is everybody's talking about the past and the present and what we can do to make it more manageable. Why not George Mitchell's approach? Why not, if you're concerned about health care, if you're concerned about, in your instance, you said, I have a food desert, I have a health care desert. Why not take some of that land and build some affordable communities where you can control the land value, where you can put in the health care, and even when corporations come to you and say, we want to relocate, say, I got the perfect community, So why not get on the front end of this? Now, one thing that Houston doesn't have that I love about Dallas is you've got zoning. I'm up there riding through a
It's not that great.
I'm riding through a neighborhood one day, and
I'll
all
take
of a
it
sudden
back.
I see all these houses, and I said, well, where can we eat? They said, just be cool, be cool. And all of a sudden, about 5 blocks down, it's bars and restaurants, and I thought I'd hit a shopping center, but they have zoning there. And I know we don't have zoning, but I do know major cities have taken over school districts.
Yeah.
Why did they do that? Because if you take a school out of a neighborhood, then it's not going to grow.
And not having zoning also sometimes is an advantage.
That's right.
It can cut
Yeah.
both ways,
That's right. It does. And I'll just say, Berto, thank you for your question. And the fact is that we're trying to move Harris County into a new way of thinking. Look, the reality of it is Harris County is not the county of our great-grandfathers. When I first joined the Houston Police Department in 1980, my partner was encouraging me to go out and buy land so I could raise cows, chickens, and pigs, and sleep in the quiet out there. You go out to the same area that he's encouraging me back then, today, and you have buildings. We are a urban county, and so we have to adjust our policy approach to this new existence, this new reality that we have. And so as far as my precinct is concerned, I got about 1,300,000 folks living in my precinct. I am trying to take a urban planning approach to my precinct. I'm working to try to create specific standards for every area of the precinct so that I can encourage residential development in those areas. But the challenge is it's a lot like the land trust and starting from ground zero. We have not been anxious as a county, unlike the city of Houston and other cities, we have not been very aggressive on the economic development policy side of the county. We rarely provide tax incentives for certain projects. So we are working to move in that regard so that we can create that kind of synergy that will hopefully lead us to a brighter future.
I want to add something very quickly. I think you're making a great point of getting ready for the corporations coming in our backyard, right? And one work that we are doing at the Dallas Housing Authority is to do just that. So we know that, I'm just going to give you a quick example, a big employer was coming to the southern sector of Dallas. We worked very hard for our voucher families to actually get beforehand interviews, right? And some people got hired on the spot. And so it's really getting ready for Uber and Amazon and all those jobs that are being created, because as far as I know, we're lacking targeting policies or hiring policies that would say, hey, I'm cutting you a check or an incentive or a tax abatement, but I need you to hire this many people from my city. And that's like really lacking. So on an ad hoc basis, absent this type of policies, we're working to just effectuate that type of partnerships, going to Amazon and say, I have the people that you need. And you would be so surprised when, we do our need assessment and skill assessment from our voucher programs, voucher holders, to see whether or not they would be suitable candidates. They are. We're not making them any favor by facilitating them, the entry to the job market. Some of them have bachelor's degree, master's degree. They just had that economic chalk that made them eligible for a voucher. So this is 100%, this is 99% of our job right now, is to be ahead of the corporations coming to town and making sure that voucher holders and public housing residents has first dibs on the jobs.
Is it really common for housing authorities to get involved in placing people in jobs and working in that area?
So the Dallas Housing Authority is very forward-thinking, I would say. I have commissions on those. Because, they hired me about a year ago. I come from academia. Housing authorities are really concerned and really funded to administer housing programs, right? But our job is so complex. I mean, it entails policy, it entails data analysis, and it's often spatial. So you need to have not only the softwares, but the technical capacity to then be able to engineer your way through. Because the scale of our data is not something that you can just manage in your head, right? You need to have the right type of team that is actually giving you recommendation and building those programs to say, this is the gap that we can, take care of if we do this type of investment. So the Dallas Housing Authority just created a policy development and research branch, which myself and Dr. Dykert are leading. And that's our job, is to, within, the confined of or the constraint of the regulatory context, what can we do that would really maximize the housing subsidy? And so a lot of it is mobility counseling with very deep interview to really get a sense of the resilience of the family. And on the other side is matching them with educational resources, training, and jobs, because our families are competent. And again, I'm so eager to say it, we're not doing them any favor by giving them interviews for job. Most of the time, they have just lost faith, and we have to really be introspective and take a very hard look at ourselves. Like government, we haven't been very responsive to the need of the community. So often families don't want to do anything, just cut my check, I don't want to talk to you some more. So we really have to work on changing that.
Do we have one more question? Okay.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for
Leo,
the panel for being here. Adrian, good to see you. I'm asking this question more from the state perspective on, we understand the challenges you all face at the local level, but you have to understand at the state level, you have, for any given development project, you have advocates for it, and then you have people saying, quit putting these affordable housing complexes here. The schools aren't good, don't build here. Other people are saying, help us save the schools, invest more here. It's getting pulled in all kinds of different directions. The low-income housing tax credit program, just this year alone in these awards, awarded funding for over 5,000 new affordable housing units across the state. Add in the 4% tax credits, it's another couple thousand units. We originate over $1 billion a year in first-time homebuyer mortgages in Texas each year. there is a lot of good going on. I've heard this discussion talking about all the negatives, and Lord knows there's lots of challenges and negatives. But could you all share a little bit as we wrap up on the good things that are working and the progress that is being made and some of the coordination and
Very fair
between the
question.
state and local?
Yeah, and Leo, you make a good point that, look, we cannot do our job without the legislature's help and support on many things. A lot of policy is being created at every legislative session. So we do obviously need that. And hopefully we would have had the chairman of the county affairs here, Garnet Coleman, to identify the efforts that he makes at the legislative level. The challenge, though, is that when you put in a revenue cap, that is going to impede our ability to do things at the local level. And I think we have removed ourselves from the previous way of thinking when we had Governor Bush, and that is allowing local control to dictate a lot of movement, a lot of policies, and we're getting away from that. And that, I think, will hamstrung us. But the other side of it, too, is that obviously everybody knows the conversation of our local school district. But it's interesting that when you've had an election and you've elected new people, and in theory that should speak to addressing the previous challenges, then why continue to move forward with the policies of reconstituting the school board when the community has stood up and spoken? So there is a lot of good that is happening at the legislative level. We do need their help, but we do need their help.
I think we ran out of time. I'm glad that we could fit that question there. I want to thank you, Christine, Drennon, Adrian Garcia, and Miriam Igufi for being here. And please let's give them another round of applause.